Chapter 6, obviously, verses 6 to 10. This is the last little subsection for us of the main discourse before we then move into the outro, basically, the conclusion from verses 11 to 18. So it finishes a number of points for us. It finalizes and wraps up in a nice little bow, so to speak, a number of the narrative elements and theological points and whatnot that we've had traversing through from chapter 5 and elsewhere, through to the beginning here in chapter 6. Some words which, at least one sentence you're probably quite familiar with, but a number of interesting concepts to cover. So let's read the passage and go from there. So, there we go. Galatians 6, verses 6 to 10. And let the one who is instructed in the word share in all good things with the one who instructs him. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, whilst we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Familiar concepts, obviously. Spirit, flesh, good, things like this. But there's a particular analogy that's being drawn out here. Of course, incumbent in some of the language of reaping and sowing and other such things. We'll explain that as we work our way through. There is an important biblical concept of the household of faith that we'll also cover, obviously, when we get to the end. So let's begin in verse 6. Let the one who is taught. Wrong part. Get back to the right verse. There we go. And let the one who is instructed in the word or is taught in the word share in all good things with the one who instructs him. Okay. Dynamic here, right? Positing two figures: the one who is taught and the one who teaches. Okay. This particular Greek word is actually where we get the word to catechize or catechism from. So a catechism is a kind of instructional document that we have in churches in the form of question and answer. Baptists don't tend to use, or at least not these days, tend to use catechisms, unfortunately. A number of other denominations certainly do. Presbyterians do very heavily. Anglicans do. Much elements of the Westminster Confession are, in many respects, catechism or catechismatic. So, for example, perhaps the more well-known portions of things, historic Christian confessions like the Westminster Confessions and Catechism as well, that other non-Presbyterians would know would be what is the chief end of man? The answer to that question is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Okay, that is essentially the Westminster's defining what is the whole purpose of life itself, what is the meaning of life question of the modern age. So question and answer, right? To catechize, which means to teach, okay? To instruct, a bit more broadly to guide, but it's more pedagogical, as we would say. So pedagogy is the form or the art of teaching. So in this particular case here, katecheo or katechieo, to teach, to instruct, where we get that word to catechize. So in other words, the one who catechizes, the one who teaches, he is to share in all good things. In this case, the one who is instructed or taught is to share in all good things with he who instructs him. Now, the question, of course, is, well, why is he saying all this? We know the context from last lesson, right? Which is that this is kind of the tail end of a lot of this pastoral wisdom and teaching and advice that the Apostle Paul is giving on the back end of what we saw in the end of chapter 5, works of or deeds of the flesh and fruit of the Spirit, etc. The basic essence here is this relationship, or him stressing the relationship between the teacher and the pupil. Okay? All of this is in the context of the household of faith, which he mentioned at the end of verse 10, which we'll explain later. But this is in the context of the church, the relationship between the teacher and the pupil, the one who instructs or teaches and the one who is taught or instructed. That there is a sharing in all good things. Okay? The gospel itself, the ministry, the work of the ministry, the life of that household of faith of the church, etc., all these kinds of things are incumbent in this phraseology of all good things. Part of this as well, especially in terms of comparison to other sections of the pastoral epistles from Paul, is in regard to what he says to the Corinthians, for example, of taking care of the ministers of the church, right? For they labour, I'm paraphrasing here, but for they labour in the gospel, right? Their role is significant and weighty. It bears with it many additional responsibilities that the laity don't bear, which is totally normal and fine, and a blessing, quite frankly. It comes with it the burden that every word that comes out of their mouth in liturgical context, at least certainly must be absolutely accurate. Obviously, the minister strives that all his words are accurate. That's not saying he doesn't. But when he is operating in the liturgical context, particularly or especially, there is an extreme care that must be taken. There is no room for flippancy in remark, for example. That's why generally the person delivering the sermon, that minister or whoever happens to be, will often use notes, right, for a good reason, because they want to be able to make sure that they are keeping it tight with what they're actually saying. Some will even go so far, of course, as to operate off a manuscript or a transcript in this case. Manuscripts, in other words, actually written out the entire, like on a teleprompter, and having it in written form there. It's only once the minister has developed a requisite level of skill, what that is depends on a whole host of factors, that he should ever attempt to not use notes, right? Fortunately, I'm at a level where I don't need to use notes. I haven't used notes for many, many years. But that requires a significant level of responsibility in what comes out of my mouth. Every single sentence has to be considered live, on the fly, in real time, which is not easy to do. And so there's that aspect to it. There's also, of course, then the fact that the minister is the one who is entrusted with the care of the souls in his flock. Right? He is a shepherd under the good shepherd, under the high shepherd, who is Christ, our Lord. He has an authority above him, and then he is given authority over the flock of Christ, right, in his particular congregation. And that bears with it a whole host of things. He is to share in their burdens. He is to share in their miseries. He is to share in the bearing of their sins, right? In terms of when his people share their struggles, when they may confess their sins, all these kinds of good things which we do in church, which we're meant to do. He has the responsibility, not in his own power, right, but of reaffirming to that congregant that their sins are absolved by Christ. A whole host of things which go along with this. Leadership in the most important avenue of life, which is spiritual leadership, which is, of course, has such an incredible weight in people's daily lives and their actual lived experience in the world. All these kinds of things. And so in this particular case, the context of this sentence, let the one who is instructed in the word or taught, right, share in all good things with the one who instructs him, right? He and keeping in mind, he's actually really talking about himself here, because he is the one who instructed them, okay? Right? So it's not like he's being self-serving or self-interested, but there is a particular immediate reason why he's saying this, because at the moment they're not doing that. They're not doing that. Not doing that. The Apostle Paul almost lost his life in Derbe, in Galatia. Right? He was stoned to within an inch of his life. Right? In the book of Acts. When he's with Barnabas, when he's with Barnabas. And to the point where even to this day there is still debate among some of us who are familiar with the Greek as to whether or not it's implying that he actually was dead or not. Right? But he certainly at least was within an inch of his life. That's what I would argue. He was stoned by the Jews and by the Greeks there and left for dead. So he has skin in the proverbial game in Galatia. That's why this letter is so important in the New Testament. And they have turned around and in sweeping droves sided with the heretics who are in opposition to Paul, who are calling Paul a liar, who are defaming him, who are slandering him. We covered all this in earlier chapters, right? And so they're certainly not sharing in the good thing that we would call charity, right? They're certainly not sharing in the good thing that we would call loyalty. They're certainly not sharing in the good thing that through Christ we would call fealty or allegiance, right? To the guy who risked his life literally to build the church among you and to bring you the elixir of life that is the gospel. There's all kinds of ways in which they're not doing this, right? By turning against Paul's teachings, they are turning against him, right? It's why to turn against Christ's teachings through Paul, which is what this really means, is to turn against Christ. Okay? His word is eternal. His word is immutable. His word is therefore unchanging, is what that means. To go against God's word is to go against the one who spoke that word, who is God. And so there is a deep sense of disloyalty here and treachery in that sense. But that's more the contextual application of what's going on. And this is where it comes down to a tough thing. This is more of a broader commentary in terms of application, right? There's a balance between how these things should work. And this is definitely my pastoral opinion for sure. On the one hand, in general, at the moment, we have struggled in recent vintage to hold ministers meaningfully accountable for what they do and don't teach. It's why teaching has gotten, at best, generally quite weak, would be the polite way of putting it. We might say a bit more colloquially watered down, right? There's probably different ways we can phrase it. But what that often really means is that, again, this is at the best case scenario, weakened or watered down teaching or instruction, which is what the context of this sentence is not a light or trivial thing. It is an abject failure of ministerial duty, because the fundamental command that the Lord gave to Peter in his restoration was feed my sheep. Okay? It is the heart of the duty of holy orders of the clergy. And that occurs in multiple ways. It occurs through the ministry, what we call the ministry of word and sacrament, right? So the spoken word and then the embodied word, right? So people are, against why the ministers preside over Holy Communion for that reason. They're the ones who have been entrusted to do that, and instructed to do that. It's why you don't take communion, you receive it. Just as you don't take the word of God, you receive the word of God, right? It's receiving. How that's been symbolically portrayed has been different across different Christian traditions, and there's good ways for doing it. We here, obviously, Pastor Mike and I, as the ministers, bring communion to you. You receive it, okay? As Christ administers himself, as his grace is administered to you through the Holy Spirit, who's the one really presiding over all of this, right? And through this, you receive it, right? And so we are, as has been the case for thousands of years, merely the instruments or the agents that God uses to employ that or execute that. And so the neglect of either or is equally as bad. Let alone when you combine poor, substandard, weakened, softened teaching, which is an intentional decision, right? It's an intentional decision, particularly the late 20th century, based on the fundamental belief of two things. One, people are not capable of learning more, maybe not advanced, but more developed things, right? That you can read about that concerted pastoral belief in the 20th century, which is wrong. It keeps people spiritual infants and never actually calls them to grow up, which is exactly what Paul actually chastises the Corinthians for. I constantly have to keep feeding you milk, right? Because you're spiritual infants. The thing is, though, they were literally, because they'd been at church for about 5 minutes, right? We're 2,000 years down the track. Now, I get that we and ourselves individually are not 2,000 years old. That's not my point. But nonetheless, right, he wants to feed meat, right, that we nourish on, that we can grow on, right? So that's bad enough. The second reason as to why that was done was because of an intentional decision in much of evangelicalism to engage in what gets called a seeker-sensitive policy or a seeker-sensitive movement. We're going to go out into our neighbourhood and do surveys and ask the community what they want to see from church. Like, what do they want featured in church? Which is the very definition of cart before horse. Well, no, it's not cart before horse, because there is no horse that justifies that. It's the definition of just back to front, inside out. That's not what that's for at all, right? The Sunday morning liturgy is for God. It's about God. It's not for you or about you or me, right? It is for God and about God, about God and for God. It's done through God, by God, and in God, and is done based on what He has commanded, not personal preferences, not our own subjective desires as to what we personally prefer. All these kinds of things. So that's what has led to that quagmire that we're in. Fortunately, though, a lot of people are so starved for teaching that they then seek out better teaching, right? And this is where it now comes to the crux of the point that we're making here. There is a balance between how we should. This is a second order extrapolation upon this point, right? But it's valuable to hear. We should always be very careful about deciding to move on from a church that we're going to, okay, that we're part of, right? That should not be a light decision, okay? Whatever problems exist in the church community that we're part of, in the congregation that we're a member of, right? We should seek to do good in helping to resolve and fix before just pulling the parachute, right? For a couple of factors and a couple of reasons. One, to simply just decide to move on at the first sign of trouble, right? Which I'm not saying everyone does that. I'm just saying there are plenty of times, unfortunately, people do though. Demonstrates that, well, a couple of factors. One, it raises a legitimate question as to whether the problem is actually a problem, because it might be, but it also might just be you put your preferences over the actual substance of the issue. So it's not your cup of tea, so I'm going to. that comes into question. Number two is it expects something of human beings that you yourself are not also capable of meeting, which is some idealized version of perfection in standard that you yourself don't ultimately meet, right? Whatever image or vision you have of the ideal church community, if it doesn't meet that, is not because it's not actually doing something right or wrong necessarily, although that's a legitimate question. It's because it hasn't met your ideal, which is the problem, right? You've got in your mind an ideal of what you think it needs to, that's the problem, right? That's number two. Number three, it completely undermines any kind of concept of community. In fact, to the point where it's antithetical to the concept of community. It's actually destructive, right? If people aborted their position in a community because there were issues or problems, right, you would never have a community of any kind, right? Human beings would never be able to build cohesive communal groups of whatever kind of variety, right? Because as soon as something goes aguts, people run for the hills. And they're just constantly moving around, right? And so it just becomes this purely individualized nomadicism, right? So it's antithetical to the concept of community, which by extension means it's antithetical to the concept of family, because communities at the end of the day are simply a organized group of families, right? Which also then explains why our families are in such shambles, because we have the exact same attitude, right? So this is my point about things being continuously connected, like we talked about in our chat before the study. Right? They don't just appear out of nowhere. They're all building upon other things. And so, nevertheless, the fourth and final point would be that it also, that movement or that idea, that attitude, whatever, also then undermines any sense of trust or fidelity that God is able to sanctify his people, that he's able to guide them in working out their salvation with fear and trembling. It ignores that sanctification is a journey and a process, not an immediate reality ipso facto. All these various elements, right? There's that. Other side of it would be that there do come meaningful, legitimate times in which moving on from a particular church community, particular congregation, is at least strongly advisable, or at most actually necessary. Okay, there are times where that happens, right? I wasn't born and raised in this congregation, okay? But everything I'm saying here is the standard I hold myself to. My exact principle is what I've lived by. I was part of a church congregation, well, obviously going to private Anglican schools, you're also part of another church congregation, right? So, but discounting that status quo element for a second, right? Outside of the church community of the schools I went to, beyond the school, right? I was raised in one church, right, and remained there until I was, in every literal sense, driven out of the church. Okay. They didn't do me the courtesy of excommunicating me, which I much would have rather, because at least it would have been on paper. But alas. Point being, and without any context, that sounds really bad. But the, but long story, you can ask me about it afterwards. I don't need to justify it here in the study. But my unjustified exile from that congregation is the final step of me then moving to a new congregation. I technically didn't leave in any meaningful sense. I was driven out. And so only then did I then move to a new congregation, which was this one, right? in my own hometown. I didn't go wandering off to find my ideal version of a congregation. I didn't go gallivanting around the countryside to find my picturesque version. I moved to my local one from a neighbouring suburb. Do you understand how, so localism, okay? Because, why? Because this is my local church and I'm from here, so I should go here, right? Within a range, okay? Unless that congregation is an absolute dumpster fire, like I mean drowning in false teaching, which some are. To be totally honest with you, there are plenty are, right? So it's definitely reality, right? It's a very big problem, it really is. But unless that place is just going to be spiritually corrosive, which places are, you should be looking local because you're from there. Do you understand? Right, it's your community, right. It's the same reason as why I'm born in this suburb, or this town. We don't do suburbs, not city, right? We use real terms like towns or villages. I'm from this town, okay? I'm born in this town. I'm raised all over Sydney, going to boarding schools and stuff, but I'm from here, right? And so I go here, I live here. Unless I have some obvious reason to move from here, I'll stay here because I'm from here, right? And that's a legitimate ethical principle that I have, and it's one that I think is eminently biblical, because without being smart, that's basically how 99% of human beings have ever lived. You're born in a place, you lived in a place, you died in a place. Ta-da, right? And if you were someone who went on some great odyssey all over the place, your name usually end up in the history books like Marco Polo, okay? Right? And his father and his uncle, right? You get the picture. And so the point being is that local roots are extremely important, and it really does deeply tie into this, because especially when it comes to this whole concept of household of faith. I know we're still the first verse, but where the first verses 6 and 7 is where a lot of the meat and potatoes is for us here today, right? Is that this sharing in all good things doesn't occur if people are just chopping and changing places all the time. You know what I'm saying to you? Because sharing in what? You're not even sharing in location anymore. So it's just like there's no connectivity, there's no roots, right? And it's why many things in our current time are so disastrous, because family has been obliterated, local communities have been obliterated, right? And in fairness, it's been done to people. It's a both and. Your average citizen is responsible, is guilty of this, but those who are truly responsible, it's been done to people, right? When a decision gets made, I'm going to round off on this point because we've gone forever, but when the government does some deal with some major development firm to build 547 new absolute shoebox houses that I wouldn't put my enemies in, and have them with bedrooms that are smaller than the size of a prison cell, and a backyard that's maybe 3 by 3 feet, and they build these concrete jungles called suburbia in our greater metropolitan areas, right? They are the antithesis of community. Absolutely no one works there, no one shops there, they barely live there, right? They just become places to sleep. Right? They live in that house, in that big housing development. They drive off to work. They drive off to sport. They drive off to the shops. They drive off to church. They drive off to literally anywhere other than coming home at like 8 p.m. at night, sleeping there, getting up at 6, 7 in the morning, and then toddling off to the rest of the world, right? So much of the destruction of community has been from the top down, right? Intentionally so. At best through careless, wanton worship of mammon. But we as Christians need to revitalise this with incredible vigour. Valuing localism, right? Valuing community, valuing the sharing of life, which is the way that our ancestors lived up until all of about 5 minutes ago. Okay?
And it starts with your church family.
It starts with the household of faith, yep. Because, as I said, communities are but an organised group of families in one form or another. Might be big families, might be some big families, some smaller families, individual, whatever it is, right? But families nonetheless, right? And so the one who, and this is the final point for verse 6, a very brief one, part of that sharing in all good things also has a material connotation to it, okay? So like that's why, for example, part of the instruction of taking care of the ministers, basically, to summarize his point to them in the other book, is that whilst your clergy are obviously focused heavily on you, they shouldn't be starving right, while they're doing it, right? If a labourer is worthy of his hire, as both the Old and New Testaments say, including Paul's own repetition of that, and that goes for everyday jobs and vocations, right? How much does it also go for the spiritual vocation of the clergy, right? They should be taken care of. That's why historically ministers lived at the church or in what we call a manse at times, where available. They would have all their needs supplied by the church, which means through the community of the people. So that is literally the fulfillment of that sharing in all good things, right? Whatever the minister gets paid, that's determined obviously locally and should be determined locally, comes through the offerings and givings of the church, right? Those kinds of things. It's also why historically, if you ever, just a little bit of historical trivia, the absolute vast majority of clergy who have ever lived have been second or third or fourth born sons, because the firstborn sons would inherit the lion's share of their father's estate. And so the second or other non-firstborn son who would have otherwise inherited little to nothing of their father's estate, which is just the normal custom, would be able to have their life and needs taken care of through the life of the church, and so they would become clergy. That's verse 6. Verse 7, which is the second major portion of our time today. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever man sows, this he will also reap. Right? So here he started to make quite a substantial point on really what we would call the moral order. Ironically, very deeply tied to what we were chatting about in our casual conversation prior to the study. But how does he begin? He says, do not be deceived, right? It's a very obvious alarm bells kind of phrase, right? It's a pastoral encouragement, obviously, right? But he's saying, don't be deceived, okay? Calling you to employ wisdom, discernment, knowledge, right? And what are they not to be deceived over? Well, the fact that God is not mocked, okay? For, and as a preposition we've explained already, plenty times, right? For meaning because whatever one sows, that he will also reap, right? That's even before we go into verse 8, right? God is not mocked. Whatever one sows, that he will also reap. Why is he saying this in light of the previous sentence? Why is he saying it at this point in the book of Galatians, right? A couple of reasons. In no particular order. One, the entire crisis of the Judaizing heresy spreading like cancer through the churches of Galatia is one giant act of mockery unto God. Okay? The entire essence, as we've been studying, obviously, of the Judaizing heresy was or is the attempt to drag Christians back under the yoke of the Mosaic Code, right? The totality of it. What we would effectively and colloquially summarize as the demand that one becomes a Jew to become a Christian, if we were to speak of it colloquially, in untechnical terms, and that all those elements are necessary for salvation. That's the fundamental synopsis, oversimplified as it is, of the Judaizing heresy. It's a mockery. Why? Because it renders the entirety of the life and ministry and death, burial, and resurrection and ascension of Christ null and void. It's pointless. Because if these elements of the Mosaic Code were necessary or even sufficient for salvation, then why on earth did he, as in Christ, bother to do any of these things? as opposed to just, because you would just continue the Mosaic code, you just continue the Mosaic covenant, right? So it's a mockery. It's a mockery of the incarnation, it's a mockery of the virgin birth, it's a mockery of the Lord's life, it's a mockery of the Blessed Virgin Mary's life, which is now rendered pointless, because what on earth is the point of the virgin birth in the first place? What is the point of the entire life of the apostles up until this point? All these kinds of things. They're just totally rendered useless, right? There's no purpose to them, null and void. So it's a mockery. It's a mockery by extension on a second level of every single one of the prophets in the Old Testament who prophesied in one form or another about the coming of the Christ, right? And about redemption coming from him, right? And the third and final level is it makes a mockery of God's own actions in the Old Testament. All the various major portions of the Old Testament, like God's redemption and salvation of Noah and his family through the flood, like God's redemption of the Hebrews from, as they were at the time called, from Egypt through the Exodus. All these kinds of images, which the apostles themselves, both Paul and Peter, point to as archetypes of our salvation in the new covenant, right? So as far as Paul's concerned, the Exodus is the greatest archetype of baptism and salvation. For the apostle Peter, it's Noah's flood, as he explicitly mentions in 1 Peter 3. All these kinds of actions have an archetypal foreshadowing, right? A foretelling of the ultimate redemption through Christ. So now all of those elements, which are deeply ingrained in the very history of the world, are also now pointless. Including all the way back to the aftermath of Genesis 3, of the first telling of the gospel. I shall put enmity between your seed and the seed of the serpent. No, sorry, the seed of the woman. You shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head. Right, which is the first ever time we hear the gospel. Right? That's also pointless. So which just basically means everything from like Genesis 3 is, and well, if I want to get really a bit more deeply theological, it even goes beyond that, because all of this has been ordained by God since eternity past. This is why the apostles and others speak of God's ordination of salvation and everything else as being eternal. That of us being foreknown before the foundation of the world. So what it effectively means is that everything from even before Genesis 1:1 all the way through to this in Galatia is rendered pointless. That might seem over the top, but it's simply because philosophically you can kind of just keep unpacking it like a babushka doll. That is why God would be mocked, because basically the entire history of mankind is now pointless. And so he says God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that he will also reap. You sow heresy, you will reap apostasy. You sow division, you will reap decay and ultimately collapse of your community, right? All these kinds of things. You sow, again, we could go on and on about this, but I mean, you sow treachery, which is what is being done here. Because again, this is all the propaganda from the Judaizers is, oh, we're teaching exactly what Paul taught. This is, it's not at all. They're completely changing what Paul taught, right? And they're deceiving the Greek and Celtic Christians in Galatia, right? The Hellenized Celts. And thereby leading them to engage in treachery against Paul, and by extension, God. And so you reap treachery, you sow treachery, you will reap destruction. Right? because people turn against each other, and then it just becomes a fractured war. And that's the insidious nature of treachery, is that you can now no longer trust anyone, which only further accelerates the breakdown of community, because communities are built on trust, etc., etc., etc. And so obviously, like this sentence here, like what is verse 7 in our text, is obviously famous, right? It's quite a well-known sentence from the New Testament, from the Bible in general, right? It's effectively a direct quotation of many portions of the Old Testament, like in Proverbs, right? He who sows the wind will reap the hurricane, right? Or some English translations might say whirlwind, right? He who sows the wind will reap the hurricane. This compounding effect. And so this whole language of reaping and sowing is kind of obviously directly drawing from that. However, it is tying into a broader analogy, which we'll come back to by the time we get to the household of faith concept. So verse 8, which continues on, for the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So again, there's nothing terribly complex in the wording here. We already kind of encountered it, but it's drawing the same dichotomy that we had at the end of chapter 5. The works of the flesh versus fruit of the Spirit, okay? Those who sow from his own flesh, in his own flesh he will reap corruption, okay? As the Lord said in, Mark 7? Yes, Mark 7 I believe it was, yes. Truly I say unto you, it is not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out. Right, and speaking, and where he declares all foods clean, right? In his disputation with the Pharisees. What comes out, we've addressed this before even in sermons recently, right? Coming out of the heart, right? Symbolic of the soul, right? The spirit. What comes out of the heart, what comes from within, is from our nature. The nature of the flesh, which is enslaved to sin, that outside of the atonement of our Lord, outside of his justifying grace imputed to us, his righteousness imputed to us, and the ongoing life-giving power of his grace being infused into us across our lives. Without that, we will do the deeds of the flesh. That's the entire point at the end of the last chapter. And we do it by corruption, and by it we are corrupted. So it's cyclical, right? That's why if you've ever known people who kind of just fall off the wagon in life, right? It kind of just they do, especially if it's to do with things like addiction to drugs, to alcohol, to whatever, right? They engage in the action, which then makes them further engage in the action itself in this kind of cyclical form, right? They abuse the substance, and the substance thereby abuses them, right? And that goes for all things concrete, abstract, whatever. It can be vices, it can be elements of certain kind, like I said, with drugs, whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's the nature, right? It's this philosophically, quite philosophically profound phenomenon, to be honest. In contrast to that, however, the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Okay? As is often the case, and this is a very important lesson of just literature 101, but in this case we're talking biblical literature, so it applies equally as so. You always follow the pronouns, and you always follow the prepositions. Okay? If you're trying to figure out who's speaking, you always follow the pronouns. If you're trying to find out what is being said, following the prepositions will always give you a much better idea. Okay? To, by, for, in, etc., etc. And we have that in this sentence, right? So what does it say? For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. repeated again in the next sentence, just with different subjects. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So notice it's sowing to, reaping from, in both cases, okay? So he's using, and again, it should be obvious, but he's using an agricultural analogy, okay? Right? Sowing to the field, reaping from the harvest. Okay, that's what it would be in historical agricultural terms, right? Obviously, throughout history, people have been way more familiar with these agricultural terms than we generally are now, right? Through no fault of anyone's. But this obvious agricultural language is kind of part of the analogy that he's giving, right? Part of the point that's being drawn here. That they're familiar with. You sow that seed, you're not going to somehow magically reap something different than what that seed was, right? And so sowing it to your own flesh will then reap from that flesh corruption. But those who sow to the Spirit, so in other words, those who are through faith and action, especially in one form, living unto God, working unto God, acting unto God, will then reap from God eternal life. Okay? So corruption, which means death. Corruption is also an analogy for death, right? So this is why, for example, David prophesies ultimately of Christ that he shall not see corruption. Okay, corruption means death. It's talking about rigor mortis. Yeah, rigor mortis and beyond, right? So it's talking about the various stages of post-mortem corruption, right? Which occur in certain stages, which Christ only met like the first three categories before getting onto the fourth and following. So corruption, i.e. death, right? He who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap death / corruption. The one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Right? Life or death. That's the choice. Right? Ironically, actually, we were also talking about that before, I think. Right? That's the kind of dichotomy I was talking about. But in this particular case, flesh and spirit being this kind of obvious back and forth motif that they've had going on here for quite a while. But the big part of this is tying back into that phrase of God is not mocked, right? And this will finalise our points here on verses 7 and 8, is that the reason why I say that all about mockery is because really what's going on here is a mockery of the moral order, the way that God has designed the world to work at large, but in particular his church to work. He has designed it and ordered it a certain way. He has ordained various means, right? He has created, ordered, and sustained it in a particular fashion in accordance with his will, in accordance with his purposes, right? So that's part of our unity, right? Which is a big issue here, obviously, because this church is the opposite of that. It's one giant example of disunity. It's factionalism, right? The Judaizers and their enemies. And in this particular case, the way God has ordained the world to work, but in this case we're talking ecclesiastically, so the way he has ordered his church to work is one of the core pillars of our unity, okay? It's why elsewhere in the New Testament he can describe the church as almost in a form of a motto, right? One Lord, one faith, one baptism. Because we have one Lord, not many. We're not pagans, we're not polytheists. We share the one faith, not different faiths. We don't all have different little heretical factions that we're part of. Right? The dogmas of the Christian religion are the dogmas of the Christian religion. They're not negotiable, they're not up for debate. If you don't like it, you don't want it, don't join. Right? And you can rest with that decision and you can answer to God for that. And one baptism. One means of salvation, right? Through Christ, that is. Okay? And so the way that one enters the church is through baptism. The way that one participates in the ongoing life of the church, its primary symbol is that of communion. Okay? And the communion is to be taken with bread and wine. Not with fairy bread and Coca-Cola. Not with beer and sausages. No, there are places that do that. Yeah. Know where you want to go. No, I've seen that. That's happened before. Yeah.
No. What did you say? That's happened? No.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, places. I've seen it before.
Yeah.
100%. I don't want to mention the church specifically, but it was in Sydney, in North Sydney.
Why do they use those things and not
What
bread
do
and
they
wine?
use? Beer and sausages?
No, the other one. No, they used fairy bread and Coca-Cola.
Why do they use that and not bread and wine or dark grape juice?
Because their minister was having this just what often happens with pastors, which is where they get what they think in their head is a grand idea, but in reality it's a very stupid one. And in this particular case, it was a grand idea of the fact that I'm trying to summarize this as objectively as I can without kind of completely hacking on him. But the point that he was drawing was that, it was tied back to the point he made in the sermon, but his point ultimately was that the things of this world are fleeting, and the material world doesn't compare to the spiritual world, right? And the kind of playing on the passage specifically was the one in the New Testament the Apostle Paul has. Can't remember what the specific reference is, but the impassable glories of heaven, right? Where we won't see corruption. It might be 1 Corinthians. I can't remember where it is, but anyway. And so the specific elements that are used in communion don't actually matter, because it's really Christ that matters. But that's just maybe the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because God has, well, there's 1,000 things I could say apart from, like, how dare you? Like, who on earth do you think you ought to do that? But A, the point doesn't even make sense. B, it's irrelevant. And C, it's still sacrilege, because who gave you the authority to change the nature of what God has ordained?
Did he do it just that once in the sermon, or does he?
Oh no, that was the first time they'd done it, and then they started doing it quite regularly.
Oh.
Yeah. Ta-da. Yeah, no, I've seen it with my own eyes.
Never heard of that.
Yeah.
Don't get hung up on the bread and the wine. It's
It's
the process, not
the items. The physical material items don't matter. It's actually, like, Jesus is what matters, which is already like half Gnostic anyway, because you're completely discounting the physical world for the spiritual, which is the exact problem that the Gnostics had.
But then you've got the Catholics that say that the bread and the wine actually changes to the body. It's almost the opposite, where it's become. Yeah.
That's a complex subject, but
Is that another question?
you can ask me if you want
Yeah.
about transubstantiation, what that means. Transubstantiation, as it's spelled as it sounds. No, look, the differences between Protestant and Roman Catholic view on what's specifically going on in communion is a very complex subject that requires at least an elementary knowledge of Platonism and Aristotelian metaphysics. Fortunately, that can be explained, not just in more than 5 minutes. It requires, but a worthy subject. However, that's a far cry from whether or not we're going to use fairy bread and Coke.
Oh, yeah. That's just, like, if anything's that's just full-on mocking to me.
It is. It's sacrilege. It's sacrilege.
Why would you even put yourself in that? Why would you even?
Hubris and pride, because people have what they think are good ideas, and in reality, they're atrociously bad ideas.
I saw a minister once get up with the church that Michael Woolley and I used to go to, actually, and when I was a teenager, and he was a catechist, like a young guy, young minister, and he got up, and I'm sure he meant well, but it was so jarring. I've never forgotten it. He got the Bible and he held it up, and he threw it across from the pulpit, and he said it's just paper and it was, and I'm not like, I know it's just paper and I know that it's mass produced, I know that it's probably printed in, I don't know. But it was so disrespectful.
It is, yeah. There is no good point that can come from it. Yeah.
I've never forgotten it.
There's no good point that can come from it because
I
people.
think he was trying to prove a point that it's the words and the.
No, he's trying to prove a point, but it's a bad point. That's the thing. Everyone has a point, but the question is whether it's a good point, and it's always a bad point because that gentleman, God bless him, will have to meet the multiple thousands of Christians from the first 300 years. Who were crucified for the specific reason of the fact that they were directly asked by the Romans, "Where do you keep your scriptures?" And they said, "Get nicked."
Yeah. You don't even have to go that far back. China, like, in country like.
Do it there. It happens now. Sure, it happens all now. Yeah.
Under the communists, you found hiding Bibles and this.
Sure.
Yeah.
There are thousands upon thousands of Christians throughout history who have been martyred because of the specific reason that they would not give up the location of the scriptures. Anyway, getting back on track here. Yeah, I'm saying there is no good point that can come from it. It's just hubris. But anyway, let's circle back. So, moving to verse 9. And let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Very obvious the kind of nature of the encouragement here, right? But let us not lose heart, right? Let us not be discouraged, in other words, is what that functionally means. Growing weary, growing tired, growing impatient of doing good. Right? And keeping in mind that good is defined by God. It is exercised through goodness, the virtue of goodness we saw in the end of the previous chapter, that particular fruit of the Spirit. Let's not lose heart or grow weary. It means in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Now, the due season part is actually, as a term, is actually a literal agricultural term. Due season or due time, whichever your English translation says, literally is talking about like the harvest season, right? That's what that phrase means. Kairoithio, right? Where we get kairos is where we get the word time from. It means time, due time, right? So due time or due season. The right time for harvesting, right? Because this is the agricultural analogy of reaping and sowing, right? Of course, if you, again, thinking along those lines of trying to put ourselves in the mind of those who are hearing this, right, and their farmers and their whatever else, if you try and reap that harvest before it's time, you're not going to have the full harvest. You're not going to have the fruit. It's going to be underdeveloped. It can die. It can perish too quickly. Like all these kinds of things can happen. You can totally ruin it, right? It's a specifically timed thing, right? And so thinking about being patient, well, if everything's going fine, that's all honky-dory. It's very easy to be patient when things are going fine. But what if we're coming off the back end of a really bad harvest from the previous year, or maybe even multiple bad harvests across the last couple of years? We could be coming off the back end of a famine potentially, right? Much harder to grow, so much harder to be patient then, right? When people are hungry and people are starving, right? So in other words, during times of hardship, literally, that's where the whole patience and faith and trust thing starts to actually get tested more effectively. Let us not lose heart or let us not grow weary, same kind of thing, of doing good, for in due season we will reap so in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Well, they're going through basically an ecclesiastical civil war here, right? They're going through a time of their entire church, all their churches across the province of Galatia are divided, right? They're being assailed by heretics. They're being assailed by people who have made them enemies, who are deceiving them, manipulating them, coercing them, pressuring them every single week, who are sitting in the same worship service on a Sunday and lying to them, manipulating them, coercing them. Right? They're in the thick of it, literally. They're still being called to not grow weary or not lose heart in doing what's good. Because virtue, ethics, principle do not all of a sudden become expendable at the first sign of trouble. In fact, if anything, that is exactly when those things must be exercised to the fullest. In reality, those things of moral goodness, right, of ethical goodness, of principle, get thrown to the side during times of trouble or inconvenience by cowards. That's really what it is, by the weak and the cowardly. And God knows that we're all weak in our own respective ways, right? And He is merciful and compassionate toward us. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the kind of weakness and cowardice that consumes you and ends up defining you. That's what I'm talking about, okay? It's during times of hardship that those things are really tested. Because like I said, it's very easy to have principles and to tout certain moral or ethical standards when things are kind of smooth sailing. When they get tested is when that gets more thoroughly revealed, right? That is the true test of a man or a woman's principles. We lived through it during COVID, where the preponderance of principles among the clergy was demonstrated to be paper thin. That for all their espousing of care and compassion, they ended up caring much more about not getting in trouble with the government than they did about actually caring for people's souls, over whose charge they have been given or tendered. They, in order to preserve the body, they cut off the soul. They barred people from the life-giving source of worship and of Holy Communion, which caused us all to collectively suffer. That's the reality, and that's what the history books will testify to. It's what people already know.
Have you come across ministers that have regretted?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good. I mean, it's
Nowhere near enough. Because so those who had honour, yet were convicted over it, and humbled themselves before God, most importantly, and recognised and saw after the fact with hindsight. So the old adage of better late than never is sometimes true. It's not always true, but it is sometimes true, and in this case it is true. And so it is indeed better late than never on the case of repentance, because it's always better late than never when it comes to repentance, right? Which is great.
so
I
knowing
believe that.
can change.
100%, absolutely, right? And so there's mercy there, and I've been merciful to any of my peers who I've ever met who are like that, totally. Because a lot of people were blindsided. Now they shouldn't have been blindsided, but they were, right? And so when someone's blindsided, it's called compassion. However, a significant preponderance have not. Whilst they may have personally in their own mind gone, okay, maybe we didn't get that right. But we don't know that because, of course, all that has happened for the vast majority like that is they have just simply buried their head and moved on to the next stage of life, which is not good enough and has never been good enough and is actually only a confirmation of cowardice. Have the integrity as a man to acknowledge when you're wrong, and when you've been privately wrong, you deal with that privately. That's fair enough. People have private lives, and that's true. When you've been publicly wrong, there needs to be an amend for it publicly. Okay, that's just a stone cold fact.
Well, it's cowardice because they're not going to, because you've said one thing to your congregation of people who followed you. Now, whether they will turn on you and leave, or it comes.
Or they won't follow your leadership, yeah. But see, the reality is they shouldn't follow your leadership because
Yeah.
you came to the test and failed, right? And that's life, that happens. It doesn't mean you're not a Christian. It doesn't mean we reject you forever now and you're pariah. No, none of that, right? But much of leadership, whilst of course leaders often learn by experience, in fact that is the primary way you learn, of course. When it comes to big significant things, especially things that are like so, what would be the word? So kind of climactic, like in terms of events, like big public things like that. Like, it's not only that, it can cause point to all kinds of examples, I suppose, including ones that will keep coming up. The real test of leadership is actually, are you capable of getting that wrong? One might criticise me for holding that kind of standard, but it's no higher of a standard that I hold myself to. I'm much less concerned with whether or not you get it right or wrong as to whether you are even capable of getting that wrong. Because if you are capable of getting it wrong, that's life and that's human beings, but for sure, don't be a leader. Have the humility to accept that it's not for you, and that's okay. Because the vast majority of people are not leaders, and that's a good thing. Because otherwise we'd just be... who are you following? You know who you're following. Yeah, right, yeah, correct. Right? Because but to have a great multitude of leaders waters down the quality of that leadership. It's kind of part of the problem with the whole concept of modern politics is we have these slew of politicians.
Because to make some of those decisions, despite what the real world consequences are going to be of,
Absolutely.
because of the conviction or that God's laid on your heart, that's courage. That needs courage.
The conviction to figure out which hill to plant a flag on, yeah.
Yeah. Which battles to fight.
Yeah, correct. Which also has deep running implications that ties into this very concept even that we have in verse 9 by extrapolation, because figuring out which hill to die on is a much bigger judgment call than just the fact of dying on that hill. So if I entertain this subject for a couple of minutes, the single biggest, and this is me saying this from the position of leadership, right? So I'm deeply kind of in that position, obviously. The biggest concern with like picking what hill to die on, regardless of what position you're in, but particularly in leadership, is that, which is helpful for everyone to know about their leaders, is that you are having to make a very significant evaluation of future prospect, right? You're basically having to, I don't mean this in the literal sense, but in the figurative sense, bargain with the future. If this is a hill that I die on, for starters, am I willing to deal with and endure the immediate aftermath, the consequences of that? Because part of remaining truthful or faithful in life in general, this is just incumbent in the concept of truth, it doesn't avert consequences, right? It doesn't. The fact that you were truthful or stick to principle, and you're being asked, like I used that example earlier, you're being asked by the Roman police, where are your scriptures? Remaining faithful and true will keep you right with God, and then you'll get thrown in prison and crucified. No, you will get arrested. Okay. So it doesn't avert from the consequences. Doing the right thing does not magically change outcomes. It can, potentially, but not necessarily. Like, something bad is impending, but if I then tell the truth or do the right thing, whatever it is, then the consequences will change. No, the consequences will definitely happen. That's the thing, right? So that's just the immediate aftermath. The other factor is then, this might be the proverbial hill that you die on, either literally or figuratively, I suppose, which means that then your longer term future prospects will then change, right? Think of the more severe scenarios of the Christian leader who is living through a time of persecution, who knows that he potentially has decades of life left or work left in the church, right? He wants to be there to lead his people, to guide his people, to protect his people, blah, blah, blah. And then the Roman authorities come around, right? It's shockingly inconvenient because he has years or decades of plans ahead of him of how he wants to be there for his people, to help his people, to lead them, guide them, protect them, etc. Right? And if he stands up on this right here and now, he's at best getting thrown in prison and he's out of the game. Do you understand what I mean? I don't mean that literally, I use that figuratively, right? Someone else is going to have to step into the shoes. Who does he trust to do that? Does he have anyone he trusts to do that? Has he built up leaders to do that? Like, what's the dynamic there, right? Can he pass the torch off to someone else? That's what I mean by bargaining with the future. It's a big gamble, right? And this is where you can be compromised unless you have a very, very well-disciplined value hierarchy. Okay, and this is the only part of what happened when I used the example of COVID that I do soften to a degree, not because it changes it, but in terms of me going not completely and utterly scorched earth per se, right? Just partly scorched earth. When you're a minister of the church, you have a wife, you have kids. How many? You've probably, statistically speaking, moved from somewhere else to there. Right? So it's statistically unlikely that you were raised in that church and then became the pastor. Right? Vast majority moved from somewhere else, which is fine, I suppose. Which means you've bought a house there. Your kids go to school somewhere nearby. They play soccer somewhere nearby. You've built up a life, is what I'm saying. Your whole life, right? You've been there for X amount of, who knows how long you've been there for, right? It doesn't really actually matter, right? Both are bad. You may have been there for a really long time, which means that all that work's now going to come to an end. Or you've only been there for a little time, which means all the work to come is no longer going to happen. So it's the same dynamic, just different ways. And then now, if I stand on this, I'll get arrested by the police. So the weight of that decision is not light, even remotely, because income and support from my wife and children gone, or at least impacted. No, I wouldn't phrase it that way. It's not a question of whether it's black or white. That's not the issue, because actually it's black or white. The issue is about the weight of circumstance. Okay, and so nothing I'm saying minimises that weight of circumstance. However, the answer is still the same. God has told you to do this. That's it. Because if the answer is anything else, then that is lower on the value hierarchy than where it should be. Because the reality is, it needs to be at the top. Right? God has called you to a duty, not a right, not a privilege, although it's a privilege for any minister. So you have a duty, which means obligation, right? Which means responsibility. That's what a duty is, right? You've pledged fealty to God. He has installed you in a position. You therefore have spiritual obligation as a fulfillment of that duty, right? It's got nothing to do with rights and privileges. It's duty. And so you have to fulfill your duty, because that is the oath you swore. Right? You swore to serve God. And the Lord, not the servant, determines what that fealty is.
John MacArthur's funeral, one of his sons, was telling the congregation about a situation when, during COVID, because John Community Church, John MacArthur, opened.
It was basically one of almost any church in California that did. Yeah, correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
would not close, and said no, we keep it going. And the son had said, well, So Dad, what's plan B? You know, what happens if you get arrested in Langston? And he said, well, I guess I'll just be having to start prison ministry.
Right. Sure.
Because that was,
Sure. Yep.
Did you get arrested?
They sued the state and they won. The state, I think they're in Los Angeles County, I think, or maybe just outside Los Angeles County. Anyway, the city shut off their water supply, shut off their electricity, attempted to basically starve them out, and it didn't matter. They just kept doing it anyway. No, kept it open. Didn't matter. Police come around. Irrelevant. And they just did not comply. And then eventually they sued the state for harassment and for malicious prosecution. I think was off memory what they sued for. In civil court, they eventually won that. Won $800,000 off the state for malicious prosecution because they were applying all these ad hoc ordinances that had no meaningful basis in law, blah, blah. And ended up winning. So there you go. Meanwhile, every other church all around them shut down and complied, and the only one that didn't shut down and comply actually ended up winning.
Yeah.
So there you go. But that's the thing, is that the nature of truth, the only leaders, and this really ties seriously deeply into the case of this whole meta-narrative in Galatians with Paul versus the Judaizers, right? The only leaders in life, and this goes in the ecclesiastical context, civic context, it really doesn't matter where, on serious issues, right? And serious avenues of life. The only leader that is genuinely worth following is the one who is willing to risk it all on principle. It's just a matter of fact. If he's not worth following. He's not worthy to be followed. Yeah?
Can I just say something? I hear what you're saying and I agree. The only thing is, do you think though, and this is what my opinion is,
Go ahead, yeah.
that during COVID there were ministers of churches who genuinely believed that what they were doing was the right thing in terms of
Totally.
closing
Yeah,
the
for sure.
churches, keeping their
For sure,
congregations safe from the
Yeah.
deadly virus and
Yeah.
all of that, and in closing the churches and following the government,
Yeah.
because as it says, as they say,
Yeah.
as it says in the Bible,
Romans
you
13, be submission,
you do what the government says,
Yeah.
and that's what was
Yeah.
the case at Blackheath Baptist, and they
True.
genuinely believed
Yeah.
that they were doing the right thing by
100%
doing
agree.
what the government said
Yeah.
and keeping everyone safe,
Yeah.
even though it meant closing the church.
No, I totally agree with that. 100%. No, absolutely. So in terms of the individual rationale, in terms of how they're actually processing, they're not doing it from a malicious place whatsoever. It's a totally, in fact, internally, they're actually trying to be benevolent, right? And so the intentions are not malevolent in any meaningful capacity. However, that almost becomes, whilst on the surface that seems benevolent, on the surface that's even more terrifying. Deeper beyond the surface, that's even more terrifying. My reason for saying that, not being hyperbolic, my reason for saying that is because by default, almost, the immediate presumption is the physical over the spiritual health. There was no thought, no meaningful thought, because I had discussions like this with so many ministers during that time period. And you know what I mean? There's no thought at all for the spiritual health of any of their people at all. It's all purely immediately rushed default to the physical. And it's not like, and this was the big key thing, anyone during that first couple of weeks, because basically the way it rolled out is China really actually knew about this like about mid-2019. China bothers to tell the world about this by about December. 6 months later, after they've been trying to desperately contain it within Wuhan and couldn't. They then tell the world in like late December, almost basically Christmas. The rest of the world gets the memo by about the beginning of January, and then start trying to figure out what on earth is going on. By the time you get to about February, late February, by the time the world actually starts to go, hold on, what's going on? Yeah. And so then the first initial 2 weeks to flatten the curve rubbish comes in like late February, I think, or February or March, basically.
March.
Yeah, March. Yeah, basically mid-March, at least for us in Australia, mid-March, right? February in America. Anyone during that first 2 week time period, I give total, and that's my opinion, total clemency on my part. I give total clemency because no one knew anything. No one had heard of COVID. No one had heard of, no one's vaccinated. They don't know viruses. Everyone's going, what the heck's going on? Anyone who shut down during that first 2 weeks, total pass from me, total pass. And that's saying as someone who was saying during that time period, telling you right now it won't be 2 weeks. I promise you that's not how this works. And not because I'm some super, I just know that's not how it works. The idea that we're going to shut down the nation for 2 weeks and that will fix the problem is rubbish. It's just not how disease works. But anyone who shut down for that first initial period, I give total clemency as far, because it's too chaotic, too clemens. We then had that first lockdown for 4 months, basically between like March, April, May, June, right? My clemency wanes very quickly during that period, but I'm even willing to extend it for that first lockdown. As soon as we came out of that first lockdown, everything else that happened from that point onward, no holds barred. Done, right? Now I'm just explaining the context here, right? Because we've had people come and who've come after this period, right? We actually held a church meeting here when I was still one of the elders, and this was after coming back out of that first lockdown, and I explained to the congregation. I said, I understand that the Premier is telling us every Tuesday at 11 a.m. that they're never going to bring in a mask mandate. I promise you they will. Okay, they're lying to us. I'm telling you, they are. Okay, I was saying that back in like June. October comes, they put it in. After telling everyone point blank, oh, we'll never do that. No, it doesn't work. Right? They completely flipped the script on that. I then explained at that meeting that I know that they've promised you that all this is honky-dory and kosher. I can tell you right now that there'll be another big wave next year, because this is how viruses always work, and they'll attempt to put us all into lockdown again, and we shouldn't do it. And of course, we went into lockdown again for 6 months. They will definitely mandate these vaccines they're going to try and roll out. No one believed me. Of course they did. They'll shut down the churches, and they won't allow us to do it without either masks or vaccines or both. And then, of course, it'll happen. And it's not clairvoyance, it's not it's just wisdom. So why do I say this? It's to answer the pertinent question, which is that individuals thought that they were doing good, especially in the ministerial side. But it's only because of the complete default to the position of physical health with no meaningful concern for spiritual health. Because absolutely no one, especially by the time you got to the end of the 2021 lockdown, which went for basically 6 months from like June, July through to December.
An unvaccinated, we got an extra 3 months, I think.
Yeah, a bit more, a little bit less, about 2 months here, roughly speaking. The unvac, they opened up in kind of, they opened up in like October. They opened up in October. Yeah, they opened up in October, but only for the special class. Yeah, and so those who had chosen not to, and again, if you choose not to, that's a whole different subject. But then those who decided not to were still kept in societal purgatory for the next 3 months. And so no one. My point being here is that absolutely every single Christian that I've ever met coming out of that especially the second one, the 6 month lockdown in 2021, including here, every single Christian was worse off. Totally worse off spiritually. Hadn't had communion, no worship, no teaching, no fellowship, no nothing, right? Because it turns out you can't just cut people off from the source of eternal life, which is through the church in Christ, and then have their lives get better, not worse. Right? Everyone's lives got worse because the clergy chose the physical health at the total neglect of the spiritual, and they chose blind obedience in many respects to the government over wisdom, right? And employing critical thinking, and actually not just totally blindly believe. Because a lot of the conversations, which is what the heart of your question is, a lot of the conversations that I ever had, there was no critical thought at all from my peers.
Don't you think that's because most of the population genuinely...
That would be true, yeah.
The government has the best interest in heart.
Correct, yes.
They say
yes.
to do
yes.
to protect you.
That's totally true, yeah.
Yeah.
That's totally true.
Got to be,
yeah.
That has got to be why.
That is the ultimate root why. Yes, the blind. That's one of the blind kind of part of it. Yeah. And so, do I think that Christians should have been? Do I think the Christians should have been thinking this through long before that 2020 time period? Absolutely. Absolutely, I think we should have. Even I was, and I was in my early 20s by that time period. So, like, if I'm thinking through it, I think it's reasonable that other people should have. But fortunately, a lot of us learnt through that experience. That's what I'm saying. That's like a number of ministers, with hindsight and retrospect, saw the proverbial light on it and went, okay, yeah, no, I was dead wrong on that. And they've gone and they've met out the congregation. They've explained, we got this wrong, blah, blah. We're going to commit to not doing that again. That's great. That's brilliant. It's mainly those who out the far side, I suspect, have probably realised that they got it wrong, despite that good intention that you're accurately referring to, which I definitely agree with, but then have just ignored that, never mentioned it, swept under the rug, and moved on. That is painfully morally corrupt. That is totally morally corrupt. Public affairs, public sins, public issues need to be amended publicly. Private, different case.
Because there's more information now. There's no reason. They know so many more facts now about.
Yeah, there's nothing hidden at all about that time period, right? The mRNA, all those issues. Yeah, the entire fallout in America. Correct.
We were hidden from us.
Right. Pfizer's vaccine has been categorically linked in court to a variety of medical complications and injuries, including myocarditis, including pregnancy complications. That's all totally verified, right? Yep, AstraZeneca's banned entirely in Europe and America.
I had 2 AstraZeneca because I was having chemotherapy then because that's when I had my breast cancer. 2021, that's when I was diagnosed.
Yeah.
It's been a terrible time.
And I was told I had to have it because I was having chemo.
Yeah.
But see, that's the thing, like, we were all...
But as far as I know, like, I haven't had any side effects from it at all.
But I often wonder, just by the by, but I wonder, because those vaccines are notoriously unstable, how many of them are actually, some were effective as in, what's the word, like,
Placebo effect.
No, but actually were okay to give, like they weren't corrupted by heat, because you had to have them in refrigeration and all
And
that.
am I telling which batch you got it from?
Yeah,
as well?
Yes, that's definitely true.
Were dead anyway, I think, and I think that's probably why a lot of people didn't get side effects, which was probably a blessing. I think they probably weren't affected.
Yeah, there were massive supply chain issues. Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Roger and I both had 2 AstraZenecas. We haven't had any issues.
Yep.
Our son Adam had the 2 Pfizer. He hasn't had any issues.
No, but the thing is also for me, with the vaccines is people haven't asked where they've come from.
No.
Where have those vaccines come from?
Yeah. There were big supply chain issues from the second they rolled it out in February of 2021.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the making of them. The creating
Oh,
of these vaccines.
Oh, well, my oncologist, because I asked him about it,
what did he say?
and he said that, don't worry about what they're saying on Facebook, because I was looking at all the things on Facebook, because I challenged him about it, and he said, don't look at the things on Facebook. He said, these vaccines have been in the making for years. He said, they're just, they're not.
Which is not
new. That's what he told me.
They used the, because they're genetic.
That would be true technologically, yeah, but genetically, yeah,
They're
correct,
genetic,
yeah.
so where are we going to get genetic material from?
Yeah.
We've got to ask those
So
questions.
he basically said to me, you need to have them because you're having chemo.
Yeah, in the same sense that it was needed to eliminate transmission, which turned out to not be. Yeah.
It's kind of like we were at the mercy of our doctors, and it was up to our doctors to be well informed. They weren't, or they heard what they wanted to hear. Some of them were pressured.
A lot were pressured. Yeah.
No, but I feel that my oncologist genuinely believed.
Oh no, totally would have, 100% would have, no question asked.
I don't blame him at all.
No.
But I think
Yeah,
if
they're not to blame.
If I hadn't had that diagnosis during that time, if I was just,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have taken them myself.
Yeah. And there's nothing, and with people,
I was
exactly.
in that situation,
Yeah.
I was kind of like,
Which is totally understandable. And people who did, exactly, it's that people who did haven't done some necessary wrong. No, no one's to blame who has or has not taken, because people had different circumstances, medical. They're working their job. Yeah, they're mandating. Yeah, the entire stuff that we had through the family business. Of course, it's that or they lose their job. Yeah.
Same with work. We lost the whole top tier of experienced aged care aides because a lot of them left. Yeah. They didn't even hear about that in the news. They left rather than they retired early rather than take these vaccines. And the younger ones took them because they'd spent ages building up their careers. Same with doctors, even more so, where they'd spent. And the guy you're talking about, he's a professor, so and that's the evil of it. And then again this mind playing stuff, where they then, after it all, they go, no, we didn't force anyone to take the vaccines. I saw Pfizer representatives saying this. That was never forced.
Yeah. Government officials still, the government's position is they never forced anyone to do it.
You had the choice to take it. I'm sorry, but when you've got a young single mum...
That's right, so the choice was you can choose not to take it, but...
We'll just
you won't have the money to pay your bills.
It's actually coercion. It's actually coercion and it's illegal.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're breaking a law that they're telling you you've got to follow this law, but you don't have to follow
But
that.
isn't it actually illegal to force someone to have something injected in their body?
But all that went out the window.
They went out.
There were new laws.
They created new laws. They created new laws to try and obfuscate that. Yeah.
And we know someone who was heading up. He's in the police force. He's now a detective dude, and he was heading up a lot of the COVID stuff. So he told us that they were getting sound bites from stupid Brad Hazard saying this is the new law. There was no law. So the police were going out and doing all these things. It was not.
Well, there was a law, so they weren't strictly incorrect in the sense that the Public Health Act of 2010 grants virtually universal autocratic power to the health minister to make to the point where his directives under that very specific emergency clause in the Public Health Act cannot violate any law. What it means by cannot doesn't mean like ought not, as in any directive he gives is legal by definition of this law that we've just written.
Well, that's what he said, that there was so much stuff coming from
his word becomes law, basically.
Yeah, well, there was so much stuff coming from him that was not, at that point, a law that they were able... I know.
Yeah, no identifiable...
He overrode those other laws. But he doesn't... You know how long it takes to make a law?
Correct.
You can't just
Correct.
do it like...
Yep.
Like, even... I know...
That's why they gave themselves that power in that law.
Yeah.
In that act.
Well, I mean, and
It's the ultimate tyranny.
And then
But
they
pure,
had
total,
to
total.
refund all these people their fines.
Yes.
Because, so,
Yeah.
because they weren't actually... It was... I don't know what law we're following. This is why I don't vote. I don't.
On that note, let's circle back to the final verse.
I can't deal with them.
Yep.
I can't deal with them.
Fair point. So then, verse 10, while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. I don't really need to explain the whole doing good thing. We've kind of covered that a lot here. We've covered that a lot in previous chapters. It's fairly straightforward. However, what is the main point here is that whilst there is a command for universal good or love, right, vis-a-vis love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, there is, however, an ordered priority. And boy, this is worthy of its own sermon. Not just this text, but others that are like it. You've probably heard me at times reference something known as the order amoris, the order of love. Basically, the hierarchy, or you can think of almost as concentric circles, of the prioritization of the hierarchy, hence the term, of love, of the orientation of your love. Okay, whether you think of it hierarchically in a vertical sense, or whether you think of them in concentric circles, almost in a horizontal, doesn't quite matter, right? It's the same effective principle. But at the center or at the top of that is God. Okay, Self-evident. From that is then family. All of this is, by the way, it has nothing to do with the self, so we're assuming that you take care of yourself, right? It's talking about other entities or creatures or agents, whatever, that are not you, right? God, right? Then family, and even that would technically have a subdivision of spouse and children, but it's family, right? It's then church, as in your local church family, okay? So our priority is not, is our people here, our church family, over Christians in Uganda. I'm speaking some random place, okay? Not because they don't factor into that, but they're not above that, okay? There's an order, right? From that, you then move to Christians in general. From that, boom, 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 right? You've got multiple different layers that kind of are flowing out from that, right? The order of Morris, okay? It ties into the nature of neighbour, right? Because, of course, what are the two great commands? Love the Lord your God, love neighbour as yourself, right? Love God, love neighbour, you fulfil all the law. It's called the law of Christ. You fulfil the two tables of the law. We've touched on this before, right? However, just as the scriptures do not leave us without an answer as to who God is, neither do they leave us without an answer as to who neighbour is. Okay, so the Old Testament on repeated occasions explicitly defines neighbour as the son of your brother, right? In other words, your kin, K-I-N, right? Okay. So in the context of the ancient Israelites, the Egyptians were not their neighbours in that sense of the term love your neighbour, okay? Nor the Edomites, nor the Ammonites, nor the Hittites, nor the Babylonians. Your neighbour is, as it turns out, the same kind of way that we use neighbour now in a neighbourhood, right? It's those who live around you, because in a general sense, who lives around you? Well, your own people, your own kin, okay? Explicitly so, right? Over and over and over again, right? Your enemies should not ideally be those of your own family or your own people, right? Enemies, especially in an ancient context, who are enemies? Well, those from a foreign nation who worship other gods. That's, of course, much of the discussion that occurs in the Old Testament, right? The enemies of the Israelites were the Canaanites, were the Egyptians, were the Hittites, were the Phoenicians, blah, blah, right? And so when you see all these references to enemies, it's always in this foreign context, because that's much of the context of the ancient world, right? But it gives us a gleaning of that idea, right? You may have personal enemies, and that certainly does apply, but especially in the context of the scriptures and of the Hebrews or the Israelites, much of the whole friend-enemy concept or neighbour-enemy concept is us, the Israelites, and everyone else who's not us. Okay? So, as that then extrapolates or applies beyond that, right? The very concept of neighbour informs our understanding of how we then plug that into that respective order amoris, right? The order of love, and the prioritization that's given here, right? So, of course, and you see this, right? So while we have opportunity, whilst we're alive, let us do good to all people, true, but especially to those of the household of faith. So here, he's commanding the Christians in Galatia to explicitly favour Christians over non-Christians, right? Okay? Now that really just should be self-evident as to why that's the case. That should be generally obvious, right? We have a particular struggle with that in our time for a variety of reasons, but the primary is twofold. One that's the ideology, and the other that is more the pragmatic outworking of that. The first of this is a particularly pernicious concept going back to the Enlightenment, which unfortunately is really much the revival of the ancient Pelagian heresy. And it is encapsulated probably most famously in John Locke's work, John Locke being the famous English philosopher of the 17th century. Probably the most influential Enlightenment philosopher of the modern Anglosphere, particularly America. And his formulation of what he referred to as tabula rasa, which means in Latin blank table or blank slate, right, where we get the word tablet from. Okay, tabula rasa, a blank slate, that mankind is a blank slate, and it's only these various elements of culture or of civilization that form and shape us to become civilized or barbarians, that cause us to be virtuous or criminals, right? But that inherently mankind is neutral. Okay, this is just pure Pelagian heresy from the ancient world, right? Pelagius was a late 4th, early 5th century bishop in Roman Britain, actually, ironically, right? So part of the same ancestry as me, who taught that mankind is not, that he basically rejected the doctrine of original sin, okay? And he had a famous showdown as his heresy spread throughout Britannia and Gaul and Hispania and the western provinces of the empire, and he had famous dialectical engagements with St. Augustine of Hippo, most famously, et cetera, right? But it's basically the denial of original sin. Mankind is inherently neutral. It's only these other external elements that shape or mold us to become good or bad or blah, right? Locke and the other Enlightenment philosophers, especially Locke, though, revived this concept just under different terms, known as tabula rasa, blank slate, right? It's what leads to it's what ultimately leads to the American, one of the foundational American ideals of, especially as espoused in their Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And whilst sounding totally nice and fine, the only thing that mankind shares in common, apart from its humanity, is that we are all enslaved to sin. That's not the context of what those words mean, however, at that particular time period, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially not built upon Lockean philosophy. In fact, it's the opposite. Okay? When those terms get used in recent centuries past, the essence of equality among the philosophers and statesmen of that time is that all men are created equal in the Lockean sense of being blank slates, right? Not every one of them believed that, right? But that is the prevailing ideology of the time. It's why America, for much of its history, has been seen as, rightly or wrongly, seen as the kind of land that welcomes in immigrants from all over the world, especially places like New York, right? Like the inscription that comes on the base of the Statue of Liberty, most famously, right, near Ellis Island, which was where immigrants would come and be processed, right? Written by well, actually the inscription was written by a Jewish feminist, but point being is that the inscription that give me your huddled masses, you're tired, you're poor, you're downtrodden, right? Speaking of low-born peasant scum coming from Europe, it's a part of a poem written by a New York Jewish woman that was later put on the Statue of Liberty. In the decades afterwards, in 1913, it was ultimately inscribed there. The plaque was put there. But this concept of Lady Liberty welcoming in these tired, poor, huddled masses of low-born peasants from Europe, and welcoming them in from getting away from all that old world nonsense of the continent to the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? Because this is the place where all men are created equal, and this is the place where everyone has blah, blah, blah. And again, all these things sound like very nice ideals, except for the fact that they're just not true. And there is a sense in which there is an equality between people in the sense that we are human, that we, at least in our original sense, through Adam, bore the image of God, although it's totally shattered. And outside of redemption through Christ, it remains shattered. And we are equal in the fact that all men are guilty before God by virtue of our sin, right? For there is none good, no, not one, right? All of us stand condemned. So there's an equality in that respect, but that's not what people meant by equality. Certainly not the philosophers and the academics in the 17th and 18th centuries. Why am I saying this? Because it is that fundamental belief, which I'm very heavily summarising, is the very fundamental philosophy that built the modern world particularly from a political perspective. It is the exact driving force of globalism as a political philosophy, let alone an economic one. Right? that really the only difference between people is that they happen to be born somewhere different, and that if they moved location and came somewhere else, they become just like us. Okay? That's not true. That's never been true, and it never will be true. Okay? Because, for example, you cannot just simply take someone from a land that has been, in one form or another, worshipping demons for thousands of years, like many parts of the Americas, like parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which have had Christianity for not that long, by grand scheme of things, right? Christianity arrives in the Americas 500 years ago. Christianity arrives in sub-Saharan Africa, at least in a meaningful sense. It arrives in Ethiopia very early on, but that's the exception. Other than Ethiopia, it arrives in sub-Saharan Africa all of about 200 years ago, right? Through the British and the French, but particularly the British, right? It fails quite catastrophically through the French, and it works quite well through the British, at least comparatively speaking, but it's all of 200 years, right? It's not long, okay? Christian Europe doesn't really start to get itself under a significantly good place until about 800 or 1,000 years after the fact, right? It takes time, because you can't just magically reverse thousands of years of ancient history of serving pagan gods, and entire civilizations built up upon that concept, from the way that people live, to eat, to drink, to work, to do all these various factors. Coming full circle, the distinction that I'm drawing here is the fact that this has even changed and twisted and caused rather a sense of chaos in regard to our understanding of what a neighbour even is. Okay? As politically incorrect as this, of course, is, I'm not exactly known for being politically correct. The reality is that let's put it in my shoes. If I move to, it doesn't matter which example you can pick, if I move to Japan tomorrow and buy an exorbitantly expensive apartment in Tokyo, because of Tokyo's housing market, and start living there, and I get a job there, and blah, blah, blah. Not only will the Japanese not consider me Japanese, they'll never consider me Japanese, ever, right? And that's right. But the good thing is the fact that they will never consider me Japanese because I'm not Japanese. Okay? I'm not Japanese. In reality, I'm not Japanese. And I can live there my whole life and I will never be Japanese. Okay? And that's not just some interesting little kind of cultural quirk that the Japanese have, nor is it just some bigoted, high-minded racism of some particular kind, or whatever other buzzword we want to use. It's actually because it's true. Okay? You can't just hop on a plane, move somewhere, and then 5 minutes later be considered the exact same as someone whose ancestors have lived there basically since time immemorial, which just simply means beyond living memory, right? Obviously, people have migrated to places, but I'm talking about longer than anyone. Their ancestors have been there for thousands of years, right? Even just for centuries, okay? And everything I'm saying, if I jumped in the time machine and went back to any other time period in history, would already have you snoozing, because you'd just be so bored out of your mind as to why you're being told that 1 + 1 = 2, or that the grass is green, or that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, right? Everyone already knows this and understands this. This is a universally accepted fact. Why are you telling us something obvious, right? However, in our time, it's become much less obvious because of pernicious, ungodly, unbiblical, and ultimately satanic doctrines and ideas. And that is the idea that people groups don't exist in any meaningful sense, that nations don't exist in any meaningful historic sense, and that individuals can be moved around to different parts of the world or different places and be slotted in and considered to be totally that thing. Right? So when someone migrates here from, doesn't matter where you would pick somewhere from wherever, they get handed a piece of paper by the government that magically declares them to be the exact same thing Yeah, that I am, whose ancestors have been here since this place began. Right? Since the colonial period. Or worse yet,
They don't even get the piece of paper.
they don't even get the piece of paper, right? And they're still just considered to be Australian, right? Or you take places that are much more, or you take places which have an even deeper root and ancestry, right? Like British people in the UK, like the actual Englishmen, Welshmen, Scotsmen, and Northern Irishmen in the UK, or Frenchmen in France, and again, this applies everywhere. The Chinamen in China, right? The Japanese in Japan, right? You can apply it to any given place, right? Where this still effectively is the same. That's what I'm using about the Japanese example, right? However, what is rather suspicious is the fact that this concept and ideology is only applied unilaterally. In other words, it is only historically Christian nations of European heritage who are expected to believe this, right? No one is demanding, and this is a stone cold fact, no one is demanding that Japan become more ethnically diverse.
In fact, there's never been more Australians going over there, and you know why? Apart from the fact it's cheap at the moment, to experience the culture.
Yeah, right,
because
correct.
They
Yeah,
have one.
because they have a really defined lineated culture. Yes, correct. Because Japan has historically been one of the most isolated peoples in the world. Yeah, correct. Yes, they've certainly since the days of the Tokugawa shogunate about 400 years ago, they clamped down heavily on foreign interference because they were sick and tired of the Spanish and the Portuguese fighting for control over the Orient. And so they became extremely isolationist, very isolationist. And so point being is that there's something odd in the water if only certain types of countries are expected to believe it. And those ones also just happen to be the ones that are historically Christian. Okay? Which might give us a semblance of indication as to where the origin of these ideas come from, and namely not God. The reason why this ties into verse 10 so very obviously is because this concept is not just counterintuitive, but antithetical to the modern prevailing zeitgeist of the universal equality, or what in the French term would be called the universal brotherhood of man. Right? This is certainly the term that the French Enlightenment thinkers thought, right? Especially as encapsulated in their national motto, fraternity, equality, and brotherhood. Right? And so this whole notion of the universal brotherhood of man, which is more the French way of thinking of things, is that all people are effectively the same. It is merely the shackles of cultural influences and ideological chains that bind them, and that if they're freed from that, and if they experience if they are brought into a modern, developed sense of liberty and freedom, they will become just like us.
Free from Christianity, in other words.
Well, ironically, that's what that means in the Enlightenment, yes, because especially in the French context, it was the entire destruction of the church and the institution of the cult of reason, and which was supplanted by the cult of the supreme being. And so it's tied into verse 10 because of this very particular word of especially. Right? Blah, 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 especially to the household of faith. Right? And so it's showing here a distinction of what he's explicitly saying. Right? You are not to treat your fellow Christians as just the same as anyone else. No, you are to treat them first and higher and better. Especially the household of faith. And it all ties into this household analogy. This is where we've now come full circle. All the way through here, right? Sharing in good things, reaping and sowing, harvesting. Notice how all of this language, apart from the agricultural side, is tied to what? Household. Okay? Which is what this is specifically referring to, right? So household, koinoneo, right? As a household, to share, to be distributed, right? Is where we get this of sharing, right? From that earlier verse, right? To share in all that is good. That basic word of household, the root word for household in Greek is oikos, okay? So it's where, and you maybe heard me use this word elsewhere, but especially in some of our early church history course, oikumene, the inhabited world, or the whole world, right? From that same root of oikos, inhabited, where you inhabit, like the house, so hence the term household, right? So your oikos, in Greek culture and in Roman culture by extension, right, was the place you inhabited and everything in it, right? So obviously the physical doma in Greek, where we get the English word domicile, or the villa to the Romans, right? The people, your servants, business that's conducted through the household, because business was always conducted through the household except for a handful of occupations, right? But almost every occupation was conducted in and through the household, even lawyers and doctors, right? If you were visiting your lawyer in ancient Rome, you would go to their villa where the man has his office. It's in his household, right?
No, they invented work from home.
Well, this is the thing about work from home. That's a total. I don't want to get sidetracked on that. We can wait. No. The whole work from home thing is a purely anachronistic. It only makes context. It only has contextual sense post-industrial revolution.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the industrial revolution, apart from the fact that the industrial revolution has made us very resource rich and, at least relatively speaking, financially wealthy, it has also been one of the single biggest contributors to the destruction of the family. Because now you were living in the Midlands in England, and you no longer can work. You can't get meaningful work in your little village or town in the Midlands. You now have to go into Birmingham to work in the factories, and so you now have to leave in the morning, go to work, come back at night, which is where that whole stereotypical dad going off in the morning to go to work thing comes from. It's purely a post-industrial revolution thing.
The 7.5 hour.
No, it's a purely post-industrial revolution. Before that, there was no concept of that. Everything was in the context of the household, even government, because that's what a royal court is. It's the royal household. It's a royal family. Everything's in the context of the house, right? It's all tied. Everyone's work, from the peasant to the king, is all in, through, by, and for family, or the house.
Giving of alms, the same for
No different, same thing, yeah.
the family, the church.
Yep.
Church family.
Right, yep, because a church family or a church congregation, the household of faith, is but a organised group of families from that local village, town, whatever it is, right? Blah, blah, blah.
Supporting the widows. And
Correct.
stuff was meant for the church.
Absolutely, 100%, yeah, not government. It was through the church, because the church is the centre of the village, the centre of the town, the centre of the community. It's why they were literally built in the middle of the town or the village, for that reason, right? Apart from the deeply metaphysical symbolism of the church, God being at the centre of the life of that village architecturally, right? So it has cosmic symbolism, right? Everything you did in life was influenced by the concept of family, the framework of household, right? And so this is where this notion of especially is the operative word, at least for what we're looking at here. And especially, so yes, there is the universal Christian ethic of doing good to all. It's something that actually sets us apart from other people, right? Because this concept is sort of touted in some Eastern religions, but like it's not really true, actually. Like when it actually kind of rubber hits the road, it evaporates very, very quickly. And so like Hinduism has a hint of this, Buddhism has a hint of this, but when it comes to pragmatic terms, especially with Hinduism, that just goes flying out the window very, very quickly. The way that Hindus treat non-Hindus in places that are not with the West is very, very different than what the image we have here. And so it's really only in Christianity, which is the only true universal religion, so universal meaning open to people of all nations, right? It's the only true universal religion, right? Islam, by scholars who have been living too long in the ivory tower, is considered to be a universal religion, but it's not, because of the utter ubiquitous predominance of Arabian culture, right? to the point where you cannot effectively understand the Quran unless you understand it in Arabic, right? So they translate into other languages, but it's a very recent phenomenon to placate people. You won't understand it properly unless you understand it in Arabic. That is the more serious, devout Muslim perspective. Okay, so Islam is not a legitimately universal religion, whereas ours is. Right? So there's been different times where Greek has been the predominant language because that's the language of the Bible, and then it's become Latin, and then it's become French, and then it's become German, and then it's become English, which is what it is now. And it will be something else in 1,000 years' time, maybe. Who knows, right? Whatever. And so it's a universal religion. So the universal aspect is totally there. However, there is a hierarchy. Your neighbour is the people of your own ethnos, which is where they get that word nation from, right, or ethnicity. It is your actual neighbour, right? Someone from some other part of the world is not your neighbour. God does not consider them your neighbour, right? And to treat them as such is actually to disobey what God has commanded us to do.
Even if they're Christians?
No, so I'm saying so it's part of this, yeah, well, they're not your neighbour, but they are your fellow Christian, right? So there's something different, it's a different category, right? So the neighbour is a different category than someone of the household of faith, right? So even within that, there are kind of subclades, right? So for us, in our context, because we're sitting here right now, our priority, again, there's no real world scenario where we'll actually come to this priority per se. Well, actually, so that's not true. There is one. I'll mention in a second. But your priority is to Christians in your country first, and then Christians in other countries. Okay, not the other way. Certainly not the other way around, right? So, for example, and I've made this argument before elsewhere. In my observation, I'm not the only one who observes this. I think it's a much more obvious observation that is starting to become quite apparent. Is that we have this very weird phenomenon in the West where for decades now we've seen a massive decline in rates of Christianity in our own nation. Right, that's obvious for everyone to see. Right. From a like boots on the ground perspective, what does that actually mean? What it means is that you've got prior generations who are proportionally speaking more Christian, and younger ones that are proportionally less, by quite a significant degree. Right. Hence why I say boots on the ground. What does that mean, boots on the ground? What it means is, it's just an observable fact for those who have studied this phenomenon deeply, like I have, is that kids have gone off to school, they do this, they get read, boom, boom, they go off to university, they go through university, they come out of university, and all of a sudden they're atheists, right? Or well, that used to be the worst case thing like 20 years ago. Obviously, now these days it's they go off to university and they come back and they have pink and blue hair and they are convinced that they're a dog. That's what that means now. Or they're convinced that they're a man trapped in a woman's body or whatever it is, right? How and why did that happen? And more importantly, this is where it really ties into this. At the exact same time that phenomenon has been occurring at gigantic rates in the West, the very same people, the West, has been investing, or however you'd like to phrase it, literally countless, we wouldn't even know where it goes, countless billions of dollars every single year into foreign missions. Okay? Single biggest expansionary foreign missionary programs in the history of Christianity, bar none, in the last 100 years. It's not even close, right? Partly because of the massive expansion of Western economies, right? So the available resources to do that, right? And transport and all that kind of things, sure. But on the one hand, when you just pause for a second and kind of zoom out to like the 30,000 foot flight level kind of view, you observe something which is not actually good, which is that we have directed countless, across that time period, literally trillions of dollars, right? If you talk about the last 100 years, trillions of dollars into foreign missionary work, right? Bible teachers, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, whatever you want to pick, right? Meanwhile, in our own countries, Christianity's been falling off a cliff. Because, or the question is why? Because we're not doing what verse 10 says. That's why.